Actually, one of the best things about events like this is how interested people are in talking to each other. And, we have a lot of old friends here, and we're hopeful that everybody will make a lot of new friends. But we also have a lot of new and important ground to cover. So my name is David Wilkins. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor here at Harvard Law School. I'm also the director of the program on the legal profession. I'm also actually the vice dean for global initiatives on the legal profession, which sounds really, really fancy, except it comes with no extra money and no extra staff. But other than that, it's a rare privilege. And I'm also the director of something called the Project on Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it, which is a very clever name that I wish I could say I thought up, but my colleague Dave Trubeck did, who's not with us here. And I say I don't wear a tracksuit and I don't sing, but I do study the way in which globalization is reshaping the market for legal services in the important new places in the world. We've started in Brazil, India, and China. We're very interested in expanding the project to Africa and the Middle East, perhaps also to the countries of the former Soviet Union. In other words, world domination is our strategy, or at least understanding the way in which our world is changing. And at the core of this project is understanding how a kind of new form of legal practice is arising and spreading around the world. And you might call that a kind of globalized corporate sector. It kind of starts here in the United States with the kind of creation of the large law firm, and not in the last century, but the century before last. The rise of in-house legal counsel, that doesn't happen until the 1970s or 80s. But really, until that time, this is a pretty uniquely American phenomenon. But over time, we've seen this kind of sector move first to the UK, where we have now some of the largest and most sophisticated law firms in the world, as well as important in-house counsel, to continental Europe, where the model both developed on its own and then also from a process of a number of European mergers, particularly with UK firms. And increasingly, we're seeing this model spread around the world, and with various variations, not to say it's the same everywhere, but the creation of what you might think of as a newly globalized corporate and distinct corporate legal sector in many parts of the world. The GLEE project is studying that development and its relationship or connection to other important things that are happening both inside particular countries and more generally in what you might think of as an increasingly interconnected global legal profession and global legal world. One important aspect of that is, how is this all affecting the lawyer's connection to broader issues of social justice, individual rights, access to justice, a whole range of things which have been in one way or another important parts of legal professions in many countries. In the United States, this intersection has often come around what we have come to call pro bono practice. Many of you know better than I, and since Esther Lardin, who's one of the great legends of this, was in the room and will be talking about this here, this is itself a development in the way in which pro bono has been understood and conceptualized, and its movement from the old Reginald Heber Smith days to incredibly sophisticated pro bono practices, many of which are represented in this room. And the question is, how is this interfacing with this increasingly global world, both with respect to what's happening with some of the great US and other law firms which are now moving around the world, the great companies which are now themselves global, and how are they connecting with this domain, and also what's happening in this newly emerging corporate sector in many countries. What's their view about pro bono? I knew this was an important topic, and I also knew that there was only one person, quite frankly, in the world that we could get to help us to really understand how to study and understand that topic, and that was Scott Cummings. Scott, I've known since he was a student here at Harvard Law School. That's a long way of saying I'm a lot older than he is. I was already a faculty member. And he has gone on to have a shining career as a professor at UCLA Law School, in which he's been influential in many areas, but perhaps none so much as this one. And I think that it's fair to say that before Scott started doing the incredibly important work that he has been doing, that no one really thought of this as a field. They thought it's important, interesting things going on, there's this, there's that. But Scott really made it into a field of study, and then showed not only why it was worthy of being a field of study, but how it was really central to so many of the other things that we care about. That's why we knew we had to get Scott, and we were lucky enough to have Scott as the kind of leader of our effort here to understand this important topic. And as he will tell you, he has assembled a really just a world-renowned team of researchers. But the commitment that we have to doing this work is that we're not just researchers, although we think that's incredibly important. We're also people who want to connect with the people who have the most important knowledge, which is the knowledge on the ground. And it's why we are so excited to have such an incredible group, not only of panelists, but of people here in the audience who've agreed to come and share your knowledge and your experience and your ideas about where we ought to take this work and what we might be able to do with it, not just to advance a research agenda, not just to advance the teaching and understanding that we do here at Harvard Law School, but to advance the realities of the practice on the ground. So it's why I'm so excited, and it's why I'm going to stop talking, because in fact, the goal of this meeting is to encourage as great a dialogue as we can have, and to begin with as great a person we can have to begin us on this task, and that's our friend, colleague, and collaborator, Scott Cummings. Scott.
Thank you, David. As always, you are way too generous. And let me just say before I begin with my substantive remarks that I feel like we're all here at some level because someone at some time in our lives sort of reached down to lift us up. And this conference for me is really, as I mentioned to some of you before, is the culmination of an amazing visit at Harvard this term, where I've learned a tremendous amount. But by far, and I really mean by far, the most enduring lesson that I think I'll carry forward for me is the example of sheer commitment and generosity that David Wilkins embodies. He is the reason that we all get to be here today. He's the reason I get to do what I do. And he is the model for, I think, how to engage in academic work that really matters and do it in a way that values the contributions of everyone and builds communities like this one. So thank you, David. He's also brilliant in building institutions and bringing together amazing people to get important work done, like this conference. And I would be remiss if I didn't start. I know some of you have already met these people, but I really want to acknowledge and thank the staff of the program on the legal profession, the team whose energy and dedication have really made today possible. So we're all enormously indebted to the program's executive director, Derek Davis, its research director, Brian Fong. Thank you, Brian, and its administrative director, Hakeem Larder, as well as Nathan Cleveland. And so with that, it's really my great pleasure to welcome you all here. I can't tell you what a thrill it is for me and for all of us here to have assembled in the room the very leading group of lawyers, educators, and researchers who have spent their lives really working to deepen and extend the ideal of pro bono service around the world and access to justice more broadly. I know that all of you are incredibly busy in making really enormous and important contributions around the globe to realizing this ideal. And I just want to thank you for your enduring efforts and for being here to share with us. Today, our goal is essentially about helping to sustain a conversation I think all of you have already started, but we hope will build and really carry forward about the power and the potential of pro bono as a tool for access to justice around the world. I think all of us who care about studying the legal profession want to do research that really matters, and David has already mentioned this, that actually helps support the critical work that everyone is doing on the ground, and that means from learning, I think learning from everyone in this room in a really critical way. And as everyone in this room knows, the concept of pro bono, I think understood very broadly as service to those in need, has undergone a dramatic global transformation over the past decade. And in introducing our exciting conversation for today, I really want to suggest that there are two dimensions of that transformation that are at the core of our dialogue. First, I think the notion of pro bono as an organized professional activity, a duty to serve facilitated by policies and programs that connect private lawyers with public need, is growing in more countries than ever before, as all of you know. This growth is varied, and as we will see, means different things in different places, but it is happening with rapidity and force, and it's powered forward by local needs and traditions, as well as by global change and networks. What we have is this increasingly rich and textured map in which pro bono looks quite different in places like China than it does in places like Australia. The model of giving back to those in need produces very different types of professional ideals and practices in places like Colombia than it does in places like the UK. So one of the things I think that brings us all together here is this moment of opportunity to really step back and reflect upon this dynamic growth. What is producing the surge of pro bono at this particular moment in global legal development, and what does it mean? Can we really begin to develop a common vocabulary and set of concepts for global pro bono that may guide our comparative research and practice? In our conversations leading up to this event, we've already learned from many of you about the fascinating and I think quite distinctive pathways of pro bono's legal evolution, from global law firms that are transporting professional norms of service akin to the US model, to corporate clients emphasizing notions of corporate social responsibility in contracting with local counsel, to national governments promoting pro bono as a way to demonstrate robust development and adherence to rule of law ideas, and to local bars that are creating intermediary organizations to help lawyers who are outside of the global corporate elite to more easily support the needs of local clients. What all this shows, as all of you already know, is that what we mean by pro bono in a comparative sense is deeply affected by things like the local governance structure, the nature and independence of the organized profession, the structure of corporate legal sector, and its relationship to other resources and organizations for delivering legal services. So when we talk about global pro bono, we have to start with this obvious recognition that what we're really talking about is a profound diversity of practices and ideas that have a variety of local meanings, all of which are directed to some notion of mobilizing lawyers' resources to help those most in need. And it's precisely the goal of helping those in need that makes pro bono, I think, at once an enormous opportunity, but also an enormous challenge. The opportunity rests in untapped legal resources that, with appropriate structure and nudging and other mechanisms for promoting pro bono, can be really used to serve clients and causes that are left out of the private market and also left out of other organizations for delivering legal services. And here I think the US is a quite important case in point. As a result of the work of many people in this room, the amount of pro bono service provided by large firms has increased dramatically over the past 20 years, with total hours more than doubling and average hours growing by nearly 50%, which is quite a remarkable increase. And this has been achieved through a variety of means that I will touch on in a bit. But the idea I want to stress here is just that it is possible to harness and mobilize these lawyer resources in significant quantities to address at least some of the legal dimensions of poverty and other significant social problems that our societies face. Pro bono, of course, is by no means the solution to these problems, but I think it can play a complementary role in the design of legal institutions that value access and equality. And as we all know, the question is increasingly not whether to try to leverage pro bono, but how to best do it in contexts where pro bono is already taking hold. But it is this how I think that presents the fundamental challenge and raises critical questions with which we all have to grapple with here today and in our ongoing work. I think key among these challenges is how to understand the goals of pro bono service as it is adapted around the world. So to what extent is pro bono about about benefiting marginalized communities and causes, about devoting legal resources to the least privileged and most in need in order to transform social systems and combat inequality? To what extent is it about benefiting lawyers who engage in pro bono by offering them gratifying professional experiences, exposing them to poverty and social exclusion, providing them with training and skills that they may not acquire through their billable client work? At some level, of course, at least if the US experience is any guide, pro bono is fundamentally about both of these things. And that, I think, is the puzzle of pro bono, and the paradox that it presents, which is how to fit together the public good and private interest in a way that is smart, pragmatic, yet ultimately responsive to the staggering scale of social need. To think about that puzzle, I think we're incredibly lucky because we have here with us to guide our conversation some of the top researchers, leaders, observers of pro bono's dynamic growth, bringing perspectives on developments from Australia, Brazil, China, Colombia, Europe, Nigeria, and many other countries that I've just learned about through our conversations at lunch. And this is the first sense, I think, in which pro bono has become really global. It is becoming an important organizational feature in the legal systems of countries that are turning to private lawyers to shoulder larger shares of the burden of meeting legal needs. And a key goal, I think, of our gathering today is really to deepen our collective understanding of the causes and consequences of this growth at the country level so that we may begin to better evaluate pro bono in a comparative context. I think this has real-world stakes, as all of you know, because you're engaged in the work. The rise of pro bono in many countries interacts with much larger structural, economic, and political changes that make pro bono critical, but also make pro bono sometimes controversial, although not true everywhere. I think pro bono's ascent in many places occurs against a backdrop of disinvestment in the state and thus can be read as a form of privatization to be resisted as much as an additional resource to be embraced. It also occurs in environments in which the structure of the bar looks very different than it does in the US, where the profession is small, less politically powerful, and more economically vulnerable. And in these places, I think, as we will hear, the entry of pro bono may carry economic risk for some lawyers whose practices depend to some extent on serving clients at lower socioeconomic levels. And so context matters here. I think there's no single story, but we must be attuned to local political context, as all of you know, in which pro bono enters in order to really, I think, maximize the opportunities for its productive engagement with the local bar, with legal aid providers, and with other stakeholders. This leads me directly to the second dimension of pro bono's globalization that frames our discussion for today, and I think this is the growing interest and investment in pro bono activities around the world by US and other global law firms and corporate legal departments. As we will see, there are some contexts in which these firms carry certain conceptions of pro bono with them when they open up branch offices or affiliate with local counsel in developing economies. In other contexts, firms are engaged in pro bono activities around the world, for instance, in human rights or international development practice, because the need is great and their lawyers have relevant expertise in order to meet it. Pro bono lawyers from many of the law firms represented here have been critically involved in transnational projects with significant local consequences, supporting infrastructure development projects in Africa, assisting in the development of legal institutions through rule of law initiatives, and working on international human rights cases through regional bodies and supranational courts. And this is the second sense in which pro bono has become more global. By doing pro bono work that really crosses national borders, lawyers in the US and other developed countries are really building these transnational networks that direct legal resources to groups in need, while also giving lawyers exposure to the scope and the depth of inequality outside of places like this. I think this work is crucially important. It's a mechanism of global redistribution facilitated by new technology and by international intermediary organizations, but it also presents its own set of challenges that we want to grapple with today as well. I think, as with other forms of international aid, cross-border pro bono work implicates power dynamics and political relations that can resonate beyond the specific engagement. As international organizations develop to really promote and mediate global pro bono projects, they enter local conversations around access to justice and social change that may be resistant to outside influence. a critical consideration in thinking about how to do this kind of work and really do it well is thus being attuned to these local conversations, to respect and to build upon them. And the geographic and regulatory divides between global firms and local legal needs are also a really important consideration. They are so vast in some situations that they may actually magnify the problems of expertise, supervision, and implementation that are inherent in even the best domestic pro bono work. Deploying corporate lawyers from the US or EU to provide assistance in Africa or Asia asks them to bridge vast cultural differences and also to move into legal spaces with distinct substantive and procedural rules and distinct structures for ethical practice, all of which have to be negotiated in order to succeed. So ultimately, both of these facets of global pro bono, the sort of institutional development in countries around the world and its institutional evolution within global law firms and corporate counsel, are really at the heart of our conversation today, which will be organized around two very exciting panel conversations led by some of the world's leading experts in the field. And I just want to preview them here. The first panel will directly take up the question of pro bono's institutional development by guiding us through the opportunities and challenges faced by organizations at both the international and local level in building pro bono opportunities and building up pro bono systems at the country domain. The aim of this first conversation is really to understand the relationship between global and local institutions in creating the infrastructure and connecting private lawyers with low-income clients and NGOs in these particular countries. The second panel will then explore the picture from the point of view of the suppliers of legal services, both within global law firms and corporate counsel and within the local bar. And here the focus is on the main trends, challenges, and needs within law firms, corporate general counsel offices, and how they interact with local professional organizations and lawyers. As we turn toward these conversations, I'd like to offer two further frames for the discussion that are to ensue. One that suggests why it's critical to move beyond the US model as a reference point for thinking about pro bono's global development, and the other that suggests that while in moving beyond the US model, we nevertheless carry some of its key lessons forward with us. First, moving beyond the US. As I've suggested, the major forces behind today's event are the tremendous energy around pro bono globally and really exciting new research that has given us new insights into what global pro bono looks like. That research has come from different streams that intersect here today. David Wilkins mentioned a few of them, and I want to also acknowledge them. One stream, again, which David already identified, comes out of the GLEE project, which has drawn important attention to the nexus between the corporate law sector and public interest law in Brazil, China, and India. I have been fortunate enough to work on this research with one of the foundational scholars in public interest law, Louise Trubeck, who's here with us today, and I encourage all of you to connect with. And our work has also connected and linked us with an amazing team of researchers who are doing groundbreaking work on pro bono in these countries. You'll get to hear from one of them, Fabio Sea Silva, in our second panel today, but I also want to recognize the other two researchers, Arpita Gupta, who's in the back, who's doing a really fascinating project on pro bono activity in elite law firms in India, and Jen Dong, who I think is also in the back, who's doing a very, very important large-scale study of pro bono lawyers in China. So if you don't know them, you really should, and definitely get to connect with them during the day. One of the things that their innovative research has taught me and others is precisely that what we think of here as pro bono looks very different in practice and has a very different meaning to the lawyers who are actually involved in these other countries, thus confirming a key insight of another pioneering pro bono researcher with us today, who I want to acknowledge, Bob Granfield, whose vision was also really essential for bringing us together today, so thank you, Bob. In addition, I think the examples that these countries and others are drawing upon, which is another important point about moving away from the US model, the examples and the models that these countries are using to develop their pro bono systems are not just coming from the US and other developed countries anymore, but they're instead drawing upon best practices from all over the world that reflect and resonate the aspirations of local stakeholders. So it's imperative to move beyond the US model as a frame of comparison. I want to say right here that this aspiration, I think, is an ongoing challenge for all of us, which is reflected in those who are on the panel today. And we've worked really hard to bring in people from around the world, but it's evident that we still have lots of work to do in this regard. So one of the challenges to myself and to all of us is really to redouble our efforts, I think, to be committed to moving forward in genuine dialogue with our allies in other countries. As we do that, I think as we move beyond and outside of the U.S. frame, I do think that it's still important that we nonetheless carry forward some of its key lessons, not because those lessons are foundational, and not because they are even necessarily generalizable, but rather because they do illustrate, I think, some of the key opportunities and challenges that pro bono confronts in a globalizing world. So in this sense, I believe that the U.S. example is a useful point of departure precisely because it raises broader questions about the evolution of professional service and the social role that lawyers may play that may help guide us in our own comparative analysis. And as we develop our comparative analysis today, I suggest that we think in terms of three clusters of issues around the causes, the organization, and the consequences of pro bono's global development. So with respect to the causes of pro bono's development, I think the critical question is, how does this professional impulse to give back to those in need, which exists, I think, among lawyers in most but not all countries, how does it get translated into this professional concept of pro bono? We then need to think about which causes of this transformation are indigenous to a particular country's legal culture and which are coming in from outside through global actors, foundations, corporate clients, law firms, and global legal elites. How do the local and the global interact to construct the notion of pro bono? The second issue relates to organization and infrastructure. So once pro bono becomes a professional ideal or duty in a particular place, what explains the way it actually becomes organized as a practice? What the organizational structure looks like in individual countries, where it comes from because it takes money to build and run, who count as key stakeholders are all critical issues in understanding pro bono's relationships to other forms of legal service, the bar, and its impact on access to justice. And this leads to the third comparative issue, which may be the most important and contested, which relates to the systemic consequences of pro bono, both for the suppliers, the lawyers, the law firm, corporate counsel, and the consumers on the demand side, the clients and underrepresented social interests which it serves. So for lawyers, we want to know, does pro bono make a difference in their professional lives? And for the beneficiaries of pro bono, we fundamentally want to know how pro bono affects not just the quantity of services that they receive, but also the quality of services available to them. And it's in this last sense that the U.S. experience, I think, presents both a tremendous success story and also something of a cautionary tale. The success is well documented. You guys know it as well as I do, but it involves a tremendous increase in organizational structure, both at the level of big firms and the local bar, a precipitous rise in the amount of hours provided at the large firm level, and a deepened commitment by the organized bar and large law firms, in particular, to being crucial pillars of legal services delivery in the United States. This transformation has been pushed forward by the convergence of professional dedication to service, really stepping up to meet needs created by the decline of state-based legal aid, as well as external pressure. I think particularly the advent of ranking systems measuring large law firm pro bono activity, which has incentivized greater law firm investments, as well as changes to the legal marketplace that have placed a greater premium on pro bono in recruiting and training law firm associates. Yet all of this success, I think, creates new challenges. As pro bono develops, it changes the overall system for legal services delivery. In the US, I think we've succeeded in creating a norm, sort of building an infrastructure and delivering large quantities of pro bono services. And our challenge now, as all of you know, which I suggest may be a challenge to pro bono everywhere, is to channel that service in ways that maximizes its potential to do good. Of course, how we think about doing good is fundamentally connected to how we understand the ultimate goals of these legal service delivery systems that we're constructing. And that understanding, of course, is deeply contested. But in closing, I want to say that no matter how we understand those goals, the design of pro bono systems should be informed by three concepts which I think derive from lessons from the US experience, but ultimately transcend them. The first is really ensuring transparency, which I know no one would object to, but we have to be able to know what kinds of services are being provided, particularly as we're constructing new systems for delivering pro bono around the world, in terms of types of cases and also in terms of outcomes in order to be able to evaluate their effectiveness relative to other models of delivering legal services. So requiring reporting, oversight, building that in ex ante into the systems as they're developing, it goes a long way, I think, towards strengthening it. The second observation, again, one that I know all of you share, is that we have to make sure that pro bono emerges and develops as a supplement and is viewed by relevant stakeholders as a supplement and not a substitute for other types of service delivery. So pro bono has to act in tandem with the governmental and non-governmental spheres to expand access to justice and really take care not to displace or even be perceived as displacing those investments and commitments to the extent that they can all work together. And the final, I think, and related observation is that we must let the social agenda drive pro bono and not vice versa. So as we design pro bono systems and build pro bono systems in places where they already exist, I think it's important, and this applies maybe most directly to the US case, that we do so with information about the nature of the problems we want pro bono to help solve, and then craft pro bono systems to specifically address those problems. As you all know, in the US, the idea of doing well by doing good has sort of long been associated with the pro bono movement. And what I want to leave you with, I think, as we pivot forward to our interesting and dynamic conversation, is that as pro bono expands in the US and around the world, our goal should be really to challenge this mantra, so that as we go forward in our pursuit of doing well for ourselves and our clients, we also strive not just to do good, but to do better, I think, for those who are in need of our help. And developing pro bono with that aspiration in mind, I know, is really the central reason that we are all here. So again, I want to say thank you so much for being here and for what I know is for many a holiday weekend, a particularly profound weekend, of course, in Boston. The marathon is this weekend, and for what I know will just be a generative and very energizing conversation. And with that, I want to now take the distinct pleasure to really turn it over to the real experts in the room and to kick off our day. And so I want you to please join me in inviting up our first set of panelists who are going to explore, again, the opportunities and the challenges associated with building pro bono around the world. Thank you all, and I'm excited for the conversation. So thank you.